Okay, so let's dive into a fascinating historical puzzle. We're going to put on our detective hats to investigate a series of pretty wild events that were recorded by the first century historian Josephus. There's a huge debate over when this stuff actually happened, and it's a mystery that's been around for centuries. So Josephus isn't just talking about some weird weather here. He describes these incredible, seemingly supernatural signs that appeared over Jerusalem. This quote mentions a star that looked like a sword hanging over the city and a comet that was visible for an entire year. He also wrote about seeing armies literally battling it out in the clouds. You can imagine people at the time saw these as major, major omens. And that is the million-dollar question. When did all this actually happen? The exact timing is a huge point of debate, and pinning it down is absolutely key. It unlocks a story that's not just about ancient history, but about how we look at evidence, how we untangle contradictions, and ultimately how we make a discovery. Now, the most common theory, we'll call it our prime suspect, places all these celestial signs in the spring of 66 AD. And, on the surface, this makes a lot of sense. It's right before the massive, devastating war between the Jews and the Roman Empire kicked off. It feels like the perfect dramatic opening act for such a huge conflict. But here's where the real investigation begins. Because when we stop just accepting that 66 AD theory at face value, and we start to really poke at it like a real detective, 5 major cracks, 5 critical contradictions start to show up. And they're big ones. All right, clue number 1. This one comes from our main witness, Josephus himself. He specifically says the signs appeared, and this is a direct quote, at a time when the city was in very great peace and prosperity. That one little phrase creates a massive problem for the 66 AD theory. So check this out. The 66 AD theory needs Jerusalem to be peaceful for it to work. But the actual historical record, which, by the way, also comes from Josephus, paints a totally different picture. By spring of 66, the city had been through 4 years of just awful, systematic plunder by corrupt Roman governors. First Albinus, then the even more brutal Florus. And on top of that, for 3.5 years, a prophet had been walking the streets day and night, wailing, "Woe, woe to Jerusalem." That does not sound like great peace and prosperity. So you see the problem, right? Josephus's own words are fighting each other. His description of the context for the signs directly contradicts the known reality of what was happening in 66 AD. One of these things has to be wrong. Either Josephus got the peaceful part wrong, or we've got the year wrong. Okay, let's move on to clue number 2. This one involves a specific religious practice that creates a timeline paradox that's pretty much fatal for the 66 AD theory. Now, this is a fascinating little detail. Josephus tells us that when those signs appeared in the sky, the Jewish leaders refused to perform Roman religious ceremonies to, appease the gods for the bad omen. But here's the kicker. In May of 66 AD, the temple priests were still offering sacrifices for the health of Caesar and the Roman Empire, twice a day, every single day. They didn't stop that until 3 months later. So how could they refuse a practice they were still performing? It just doesn't add up. Look, this refusal only makes logical sense if the signs happened at a time when they actually had a choice. A time when they were still making the general sacrifices for Rome, but decided this particular omen didn't warrant a special extra Roman ceremony. By 66 AD, stopping the sacrifices was an act of rebellion, a totally different thing. All right, for our third clue, let's switch gears and look at the biblical framework, because there's this kind of prophetic clock ticking in the background with a very specific number of days that has to line up. So, in the books of Daniel and Revelation, you see this key prophetic period that lasts 1,260 days. It's often tied to that final intense crisis leading up to the temple's destruction. So, if the signs of 66 AD were the starting gun for that final countdown, you'd expect the math to work out, right? Well, let's do the math. We know the exact date the daily sacrifices stopped in the temple. It was July 14th, 70 AD. That's our endpoint. So if you count backward 1,260 days from that date, you land on January 31st, 67 AD. Not May of 66, that's a full 9 months off. It means the supposed prophetic signs of 66 AD have no mathematical link to the very timeline they're supposed to be starting. So let's just lay out the whole case file. When you put all the evidence together, the argument for 66 AD just completely collapses. The comet would have appeared during oppression, not peace. The claim of great peace ignores a prophet screaming doom. The sacrifice refusal is illogical. The prophetic countdown doesn't line up. And as you can see here, it even seems to mix up two totally separate events in the sky. The case against our prime suspect is pretty overwhelming. So, if 66 AD is a bust, then what's the answer? This is the really cool part. When you let the evidence lead the way, a completely different and way clearer timeline starts to emerge from all the chaos. I mean, just look at this 66 AD timeline again. It's a complete mess. You have peace during oppression, calm while a prophet is wailing about doom, refusing a sacrifice you're still making, a countdown that starts with no connection to the signs. Nothing holds together. But now, watch what happens when we shift the date of those main signs back to the year 62 AD. Suddenly, every single one of those contradictions just disappears. The signs now appear during a period of actual peace. The prophet, Jesus, son of Ananias, starts his warnings after the signs, which marks the end of that peace. And that 1260-day countdown, it starts perfectly on schedule in 67 AD, kicked off by a second, separate event in the sky, a battle, not just a display. Every single piece just clicks perfectly into place. And you might be sitting there thinking, okay, 62 AD, 66 AD, what's the big deal? Why is this so important? Well, it matters because it completely changes our whole understanding of the story leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. See, instead of having all this drama just crammed into one chaotic year, the 62 AD timeline shows us something much more profound. It reveals a long, patient, 9-year period of escalating warnings. It starts with signs in the sky during a time of peace, then weird things happening at the temple, then a human prophet crying doom for years, and only then does the final war and judgment actually begin. It's a much deeper, more patient story. And you know, this whole investigation really points to something bigger, not just about this one puzzle, but about how we should approach any complex question. Like the slide says, what we're really after isn't about winning for our side, it's about finding the truth. And the best way to get to the truth is to engage with ideas seriously, but also with kindness. And that really leaves us with this final crucial question. This whole detective story teaches us a powerful lesson. We should absolutely pursue truth with rigor, weigh the evidence, challenge our assumptions, but we have to do it while treating people who see things differently with charity and respect. Because at the end of the day, the search for truth and the practice of love, they've got to go hand in hand.